There is a moment in psychological development that almost no one warns you about. It doesn't happen at the beginning of the journey. It appears later, after you have already done significant inner work, after you have become less reactive, more self-aware, more emotionally stable. You have examined your patterns. You have confronted parts of your shadow. You understand your triggers better than before. You recognize projections when they appear. In many ways, you feel different from the person you once were. Earlier in life, situations easily pulled you into emotional reactions. Now you remain calm. Earlier, you struggled with internal fragmentation. Now you feel more integrated. Earlier, you chase validation. Now you feel less dependent on it. All of this reflects genuine psychological growth. Carl Jung believed that individuation gradually leads the individual toward greater wholeness. The psyche becomes more integrated, more conscious, and less controlled by unconscious patterns. But Jung also warned about something that often appears after these milestones: a new danger, not the old insecurity, not the old confusion, something much subtler. The ego begins rebuilding itself around the identity of being psychologically evolved. This shift is almost invisible at first, because on the surface, everything still looks like growth. You remain calm in situations that once triggered you. You recognize unconscious patterns in others. You see dynamics that many people seem unaware of. And gradually, a quiet thought may begin appearing in the background of your awareness. I see things differently now. I understand dynamics others don't notice. I've moved beyond certain struggles. None of these thoughts are necessarily false, but something subtle begins happening underneath them. Your growth becomes part of your identity. And when that happens, the ego quietly reorganizes itself around that identity. Carl Jung referred to this phenomenon as ego inflation. Inflation occurs when the ego begins to identify with something larger than itself. Earlier in life, the ego might inflate through power, status, or success. Later in psychological development, it can inflate through self-awareness, through spiritual language, through the identity of being conscious or healed. The danger here is not obvious, because the person experiencing inflation often appears calm, reflective, and insightful. They speak about awareness. They speak about integration. They speak about emotional maturity. But internally, a subtle shift has occurred. Instead of simply experiencing growth, the ego begins claiming ownership of it. Growth becomes proof of superiority, not openly, not arrogantly, but quietly, almost invisibly. Carl Jung warned that psychological insight can easily become another tool for the ego. The ego does not disappear simply because you become self-aware. It adapts. It refines itself. It learns new language. It adopts new identities. And one of the most sophisticated identities the ego can adopt is the identity of being more aware than others. This is why the period after significant inner work can sometimes create a surprising internal change. You may notice that certain behaviors around you now feel obvious. You see emotional patterns in people. You recognize projections. You notice unconscious motivations behind their reactions. Earlier in life, you might have been part of those same dynamics. Now you observe them from a distance. And this distance can slowly create something else. Comparison. Not necessarily harsh comparison. Often very subtle. You may notice yourself thinking, why do people still react this way? Why don't they see what's happening? Why are they repeating the same patterns? These questions may arise naturally, but if they are not examined carefully, they can evolve into something more dangerous. A feeling of psychological elevation, the sense that you have moved beyond certain human struggles. Carl Jung warned that this moment represents a critical stage in individuation, because the ego, having lost many of its earlier defenses, begins searching for a new foundation. And sometimes it finds that foundation in spiritual identity. Instead of being proud of success, it becomes proud of awareness. Instead of being proud of power, it becomes proud of insight. Instead of seeking validation through achievement, it seeks validation through psychological growth. This shift is extremely difficult to detect because on the surface, the language remains humble. The person may speak about shadow work, integration, consciousness, but internally, the ego has reorganized itself around a new narrative. I am someone who has evolved. Carl Jung believed that this is one of the most dangerous moments in psychological development, because once the ego identifies with growth, it becomes resistant to further transformation. Why? Because the identity of being evolved must now be protected. The ego begins avoiding situations that challenge this image. It resists criticism that suggests there is still unconscious material to confront. It prefers environments where its insight appears validated. This is why Jung warned that the shadow does not disappear when we grow. It evolves with us. The more conscious we become, the more subtle the shadow becomes. Earlier, the shadow might have appeared through anger, insecurity, or jealousy. Later, it may appear through spiritual superiority, through the quiet belief that you are more aware than others. Carl Jung believed that true individuation requires constant humility precisely because the unconscious never disappears. No matter how much inner work you do, the psyche remains vast. There will always be aspects of yourself that remain unseen. And this realization protects you from the trap of inflation. Because once you believe you have arrived, the growth stops. But when you recognize that awareness is an ongoing process, humility naturally appears. The danger after healing is not falling back into old patterns. The danger is believing that you have transcended them completely. And that belief can quietly rebuild the very ego structure that individuation was meant to transform. The person who once struggled with insecurity may now struggle with subtle superiority. The person who once chased validation may now seek validation for being self-aware. Carl Jung often emphasized that psychological maturity does not eliminate the ego. It places the ego in the correct relationship with the self. The ego remains a necessary part of the psyche, but must not become inflated by identifying with psychological insight itself. Because when awareness becomes an identity, the individual stops questioning themselves. And that is the moment when growth quietly begins turning into another form of unconsciousness. The challenge, therefore, is not simply to grow. It is to remain aware even of the ego that forms around growth itself. And recognizing that possibility is the first step toward avoiding the hidden danger that appears after healing. There is a particular shift that can occur after significant psychological growth, and it rarely announces itself openly. It appears quietly. At first, it feels almost like clarity. You begin noticing patterns in people's behavior much more easily. Someone becomes defensive during a conversation, and you immediately recognize the insecurity behind it. Someone reacts emotionally, and you can see the projection taking place. Someone repeats the same relational pattern, and you recognize the unconscious dynamic driving it. Earlier in life, these patterns might have felt confusing. Now they feel obvious. Your awareness has sharpened. Your perception of human behavior has deepened. Carl Jung believed that this kind of psychological awareness naturally increases as individuation progresses. When projections withdraw and unconscious patterns become conscious, the individual begins seeing dynamics that were previously invisible. But here is where something subtle begins happening. The clarity of perception can slowly create a sense of distance between you and the people around you. You begin noticing reactions that once belonged to you, but no longer dominate your behavior. You see emotional defensiveness. You see avoidance. You see insecurity playing out in conversations. And because you've already confronted many of these patterns within yourself, they appear more clearly when they appear in others. At first, this observation is neutral. You simply notice. But over time, another layer can begin forming. You may catch yourself thinking, I used to react like that. I don't fall into those dynamics anymore. Why can't they see what they're doing? These thoughts often appear quietly, not aggressively, not with obvious arrogance, but they begin establishing a subtle comparison between your level of awareness and the awareness of others. Carl Jung warned that this moment represents a critical psychological turning point, because comparison, even when it appears subtle, feeds the ego. The ego begins reorganizing itself around the idea of having progressed beyond certain patterns. And when that happens, awareness slowly transforms into identity. You are no longer simply someone who observes psychological dynamics. You begin identifying as someone who is more conscious than the people around you. Carl Jung referred to this phenomenon as a form of spiritual inflation. Inflation occurs when the ego identifies with psychological insight and expands beyond its proper limits. Instead of remaining grounded in humility, The ego quietly claims the territory of awareness as its own achievement. Earlier, the ego might have built its identity around success, career achievements, recognition, power. Later in psychological development, the ego may build its identity around something far more subtle, consciousness itself. You may begin seeing yourself as someone who has transcended ordinary emotional patterns, someone who understands dynamics that others miss, someone who has moved beyond certain human struggles. And again, none of these perceptions are entirely false. You have likely grown. You have likely developed greater awareness. But the danger lies in the psychological structure that begins forming around that awareness. Instead of remaining curious about your own unconscious material, the ego begins focusing primarily on the unconsciousness of others. You start noticing their projections, their emotional reactions, their unresolved patterns. And while observation itself is not harmful, the ego may quietly use those observations as confirmation of its own advancement. Carl Jung believed that the ego is extraordinarily adaptable. If it can no longer gain validation through status or power, it will seek validation through psychological insight. If it can no longer claim superiority through success, it may claim superiority through self-awareness. This is why spiritual traditions across cultures repeatedly warn about the danger of spiritual pride, not the pride of obvious arrogance, but the pride of believing that one has become immune to unconsciousness. Carl Jung often emphasized that the unconscious never disappears. No matter how much inner work a person does, there will always remain aspects of the psyche that are not yet visible. The unconscious is vast. It evolves. It changes. And as consciousness expands, new layers of unconscious material appear. But when the ego becomes inflated by awareness, it begins resisting this truth, because the identity of being evolved must now be protected. This protection creates a subtle psychological shift. Instead of asking, "What am I still unconscious of?" the ego begins asking, "Why are others still unconscious?" And this change redirects attention outward rather than inward. Self-reflection decreases. Observation of others increases. Carl Jung believed that this is one of the most deceptive traps in advanced psychological development, because the individual may appear highly self-aware while simultaneously becoming blind to their own inflation. The language remains reflective. The vocabulary remains psychological, but the attitude behind it slowly shifts. Humility is replaced by quiet certainty. Curiosity is replaced by interpretation. The individual begins believing they understand people better than people understand themselves. And while deeper perception can certainly develop during individuation, Jung repeatedly warned that the psyche is far more complex than any one individual can fully comprehend. The moment you believe you fully understand human nature is often the moment your own unconscious has regained control, because genuine awareness always includes recognition of its limits. Carl Jung once observed that psychological insight can create the illusion of mastery, but the psyche cannot be mastered in that way. It can only be explored continuously, and that exploration requires humility. The humility to recognize that growth does not make you immune to unconscious forces. It simply makes those forces more subtle. Earlier, the ego might have appeared through insecurity. Now it may appear through superiority. Earlier, the ego might have defended itself through aggression. Now it may defend itself through interpretation. The ego does not disappear when you grow. It evolves alongside your awareness. And if that evolution goes unnoticed, the very work that was meant to dissolve ego identification can end up strengthening it in a more refined form. This is why Jung believed that the deeper stages of individuation require not only awareness but vigilance, not only insight but humility. Because the more consciousness expands, the more sophisticated the ego becomes in disguising itself as awareness. And recognizing that possibility is the only way to prevent psychological growth from quietly transforming into psychological inflation. There is a paradox at the heart of psychological growth that Carl Jung repeatedly warned about. The very insight that frees you from unconscious patterns can also become the foundation of a new unconscious identity. Earlier in life, the ego may have been built around obvious structures: success, recognition, status, approval. These were clear forms of validation. The ego could easily attach itself to them because they were visible and socially reinforced. But when a person begins serious inner work, many of these external structures lose their power. You stop chasing validation in the same way. You stop relying entirely on approval from others. You begin questioning social roles that once defined your identity. From the outside, this looks like liberation. And in many ways, it is. But inside the psyche, something important is happening. The ego has lost its previous foundations. And because the ego cannot simply disappear, it begins searching for a new structure to organize itself around. Carl Jung believed that when the ego loses one form of identification, it almost always looks for another. If it can no longer define itself through status, it may define itself through insight. If it can no longer define itself through success, it may define itself through awareness. If it can no longer say, I am valuable because I achieved something, it may begin saying something far more subtle. I am valuable because I understand things others do not. This is the moment when psychological growth begins quietly transforming into a new form of identity. And the danger is that this identity often appears extremely refined. You no longer feel the need to prove yourself. You remain calm in situations where others react emotionally. You recognize unconscious patterns quickly. You can observe dynamics that once confused you. All of these qualities reflect real development. But when the ego attaches itself to them, a subtle psychological shift occurs. Awareness becomes possession. Insight becomes territory. Growth becomes status. Carl Jung described this process as a form of inflation through identification with the self. The self represents the deeper organizing center of the psyche, something far greater than the ego itself. But when the ego begins identifying with the qualities emerging from the self, it can mistakenly believe that those qualities belong to the ego. In other words, the ego begins claiming ownership of psychological depth. Instead of recognizing awareness as something that flows through the psyche, the ego begins thinking, I am the one who is aware. I am the one who sees more clearly. This subtle shift is extremely difficult to notice because the person experiencing it often continues practicing self-reflection. They continue speaking about humility. They continue exploring psychological ideas. But the emotional tone behind that exploration changes. Earlier, awareness was driven by curiosity. Now it may be driven by certainty. Earlier, insight created openness. Now it may create quiet authority. Carl Jung warned that the ego is particularly vulnerable to inflation when it encounters the deeper structures of the psyche, because the experience of psychological insight can feel profound. You begin seeing patterns in yourself and others. You begin understanding human behavior in ways that once seemed mysterious. This clarity can feel powerful, but Jung emphasized that the clarity does not belong to the ego alone. It emerges from the deeper intelligence of the psyche itself. When the ego mistakes that intelligence for its own achievement, inflation begins. And inflation has a very specific psychological effect. It separates the individual from the ongoing process of growth, because the ego that believes it has reached a higher level will resist situations that challenge that belief. You may notice subtle changes in how you relate to certain experiences. Criticism may feel less welcome. Conversations with people who disagree with your perspective may feel less interesting. You may feel drawn toward environments where your insight is recognized rather than questioned. Carl Jung believed that these subtle shifts indicate that the ego has quietly reclaimed the center of the personality, not in the old way, but in a more sophisticated form. Instead of defending itself through insecurity, it defends itself through interpretation. Instead of seeking approval through success, it seeks confirmation through awareness. The ego becomes invested in maintaining the identity of being someone who has evolved. And this is why Jung warned that psychological insight does not eliminate the shadow. It transforms it. Earlier, the shadow may have appeared through obvious emotional reactions, anger, jealousy, fear. Later, the shadow may appear through something far more difficult to detect. Subtle superiority, quiet detachment, the belief that you have transcended dynamics that still affect others. Carl Jung believed that the only safeguard against this form of inflation is humility, not performative humility, not the kind that says, I'm still learning, while secretly believing otherwise, but genuine recognition that the unconscious is inexhaustible. No matter how much awareness you develop, there will always remain parts of the psyche that are not yet visible. There will always be deeper layers of the shadow. There will always be aspects of the self that the ego cannot fully comprehend. This realization changes the entire orientation of psychological growth. Instead of striving to become more evolved, the individual returns to curiosity. Instead of identifying with awareness, they remain in relationship with it. Instead of claiming psychological insight as personal achievement, they recognize it as participation in something larger than the ego. Carl Jung believed that true individuation does not produce superiority. It produces humility. Because the deeper the psyche is explored, the clearer it becomes that human consciousness can never fully grasp its own depth. And that realization protects the individual from the final trap that often appears after healing. The belief that growth has reached its conclusion. In reality, growth never concludes. Awareness never reaches a final stage. The psyche continues unfolding for as long as life continues. And remembering that truth keeps the ego from quietly rebuilding itself around the identity of being someone who has already arrived. There is a moment in psychological growth that feels like arrival. You have done the work. You are less reactive. You understand your patterns. You recognize projections. You feel more stable, more integrated, more aware. The chaos that once defined your inner life has quieted. And naturally, a thought can appear. I've come far. And in many ways, that thought is true. Carl Jung believed that individuation leads to real psychological transformation. When the unconscious becomes more conscious, the personality becomes less fragmented, less reactive, and more aligned with the deeper self. But Jung also insisted on something that many people overlook. Growth does not eliminate the ego. It refines it. It teaches it new language. It gives it more subtle forms of identity. And one of the most sophisticated identities the ego can adopt is the identity of being aware. This is why the stage after healing can be so delicate, not because growth stops, but because the ego begins quietly attaching itself to that growth. You may begin seeing dynamics others don't see. You may recognize unconscious reactions immediately. You may feel less pulled into emotional conflicts. And slowly, a new internal narrative may begin forming. I understand these patterns. I see what others miss. I've moved beyond certain dynamics. Again, none of this is necessarily false. But Carl Jung warned that the moment awareness becomes an identity, the ego has quietly returned to the center of the personality, not as insecurity, not as aggression, but as subtle superiority. And superiority is one of the shadow's most refined disguises, because it allows the ego to feel elevated while still appearing humble. Jung often reminded his students that the unconscious is not something that disappears. It is something that evolves. Every stage of development reveals new layers. Every insight reveals deeper complexity. The psyche is not a problem to be solved. It is a reality to be explored continuously. That is why true individuation always leads back to humility, not forced humility, not the humility of pretending to know less than you do, but the humility that emerges when you realize how vast the human psyche truly is. The more awareness grows, the more mystery appears. The more insight you gain, the more you recognize how much remains unseen. Carl Jung once observed that the greatest danger in psychological work is believing that you have finally understood yourself. Because the moment that belief solidifies, curiosity disappears. And curiosity is the force that keeps consciousness alive. Without curiosity, awareness turns into certainty. Without curiosity, growth becomes identity. And identity eventually becomes another unconscious structure. The task, therefore, is not to eliminate the ego. That is impossible. The task is to keep the ego in the correct relationship with the self. The ego is a participant in the psyche, not its ruler, not its final authority. And when the ego remembers that, growth continues. Awareness remains flexible. Humility remains natural. Before we close, consider something honestly. Have you ever noticed a moment where your psychological growth subtly turned into comparison? Where you began seeing others as less aware, less conscious, less evolved? If so, you're not alone. This moment is one of the most common turning points in deeper psychological development. Share your experience in the comments. Someone reading your reflection may recognize the same dynamic within themselves. And if this video helped you recognize a hidden shadow that can appear after healing, share it with someone who is also walking the path of self-awareness. Because the most important lesson Carl Jung left us with is not how to become perfect. It is how to remain human, growing, questioning, discovering, again and again. Because the moment we believe we have finally arrived is often the moment the ego quietly begins building a throne.